Thank you so much for coming back for our next session, and particularly for our next keynote speech. My name is Maria Eckstein. I'm a research scientist at Google DeepMind, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Leyla Isik. Professor Isik received her Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Johns Hopkins University and her PhD in Computational Biology from MIT. She was a postdoc with Nancy Canwisher at MIT and with Gabriel Crayman at Harvard Medical School. Since 2019, Professor Isik has been the Claire Booth Luce Assistant Professor at the Department of Cognitive Science and is affiliated with the Department of Biomedical Engineering, the Kavli Neuroscience Discovery Institute, and the Data Science and AI Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Isik is a leading expert in the field of vision and social perception. She leads the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory, which is very fitting for this conference, where she investigates how humans are able to perceive the world with such unparalleled speed and detail. So we can detect objects and people, but we also detect emotions, goals, and social interactions, and she will tell us more about that in her lecture. Professor Isik investigates how humans do this using a combination of methods, including neuroimaging, intracranial recordings, machine learning, and behavioral techniques. Professor Isik has received a Faculty Research Award by Google AI, an American Physiological Society APS Select Award for article A Fast Invariant Representation for Human Action in the Visual System, and many other awards over the years. She has also served on the organizing committee for this conference, CCN, for several years, and was the chair of the program committee last year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Leyla Isik.
Thank you so much, Maria, and to all of the organizers for inviting me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. So today I'm going to talk to you about seeing social interactions. This is a video of my son Rami and his friend Sylvia. And before I even press play, you can recognize all sorts of things. You can tell there are two kids, they're outside on the grass, they have baskets. Maybe you've even checked out Rami's cool sunglasses. And when I press play, though, an even richer story unfolds. Even though I'm playing the video without any sound, you can tell that they're communicating. You can tell they have a goal to open up that egg. And you can tell that they're helping each other achieve this goal. You might also be thinking about their mental states or motivations. So why do they want to get in that egg? Maybe there's candy inside that they're going to eat or even share with their friends. Now, over the last several decades, we've made amazing progress on this first set of problems in scene and object recognition. So not to say that these are solved problems by any means, but we have a pretty good idea of the neural substrate that supports these abilities, as well as a wealth of computational models that can do these tasks in a way that almost is human-like. And this is also where a traditional view of vision has really stopped at static scene and object perception. But today I'm going to argue that we should be considering a richer definition of vision, and in turn, more complex tasks that we're evaluating our vision models on, like this second group here. And in particular, a major focus of our research is on social interaction perception. So for example, how you recognize that helping interaction between Rami and Sylvia. You can recognize this information very effortlessly, not just in natural videos, but even in very stripped-down visual displays. So for example, this yellow triangle is also helping the red circle get up the hill. And you can tell this even infants can tell that this is different than when this blue square is hindering the same circle. Many of these abilities are shared with even our close primate relatives. And a central question we try to understand in our research is, how do we as humans do this? What are the computations that support this? And in turn, how can we get computational models to do the same? Now, I want to impress on you that this is a really hard problem, right? So effortlessly, but across two very different stimulus, you were able to recognize that these are both help. And unlike static scene and object recognition, we don't have the same wealth of computational models that can solve these tasks. But I do have ChatGPT. So I put this video into ChatGPT and asked it to tell me what's happening. Unsurprisingly, it did a pretty good job, right? So recognized two kids sitting on the grass outside, the basket, and even the sunglasses. So 4 out of 4 on those scene and object tasks. It even seems to have some information about their intentions and actions, right? So both children seem focused and engaged in their activity. So I asked it, are the two children interacting? And it says the children in the video do not appear to be interacting. While they are in close proximity, they're each engrossed in their own task rather than engaging with each other. This was true even when I tried to feed in key frames like this one here, where there's a clear act of joint attention on the egg between the two kids. And this suggests that while these systems, many other people have shown, while these systems do a good job at a lot of different tasks, they're still missing some things that we have as humans. Lots of cognitive scientists have pointed out what some of these things might be. So for example, these systems don't have human-like theory of mind. They can't really understand other people's mental states in the same way that we can. And similarly, while they have something that looks a lot like human world knowledge from all of their vast training data, it still seems to be lacking something. That said, although I think you engaged both of these while you watched that video, I think growing evidence now suggests that there are core elements of recognizing social interactions that don't rely on either of these, but instead are based largely on visual computations. And so today I'm going to organize my talk into 2 different parts. In the first section, I'm going to review evidence from our lab and others, suggesting that social interactions are prioritized by the human visual system, rather than other cognitive systems like the theory of mind network. I think this is an interesting theoretical question, and it's also one that has practical implications, because if we can do this with our vision, we should also be able to get our vision models to solve these tasks as well. And so then in the second part of the talk, I'll give you an overview of how current computer vision models do on these tasks, and tell you about some modeling work from our own lab that suggests that there are key things that many of these models are missing, in particular, a reliance on dynamics and relational information. So this information is particularly important for social perception, but then at the end, I'll talk about how I think it's important for us studying vision, everybody studying vision more broadly. All right. So in a recent Trends in Cognitive Sciences article co-written with Emily McMahon, we reviewed growing evidence that suggests that the human visual system prioritizes other people's social interactions. This involves both visual spatial cues that are related to social interactions, like whether people are close by, facing each other, and moving contingently. But we argued it goes even beyond these kind of clearly visual cues to include some core components of social interactions themselves. So we argued that this involves whether people are engaged in a physical interaction, like dancing or fighting, a communicative interaction, like when they're talking, as well as some high-level information, like whether they're acting in a goal-compatible manner, like in that helping video I showed you. Because I'm talking about vision, these are things that are happening on relatively small spatiotemporal timescales, so when two people are in the same nearby physical space, and also on the order of like a second. So this doesn't apply to things like if you're talking on the phone or watching somebody talk on the phone or collaborate in more abstract long-term ways, though I'm happy to speculate about those later. All right, so there's a significant amount of behavioral evidence that suggests that social interactions share many hallmarks of visual processing. They're recognized quickly and automatically. So for example, a large body now of work from Luba Papeo's lab has suggested that if you flash stimuli like these to participants very quickly, they're much better at recognizing the bodies when they're facing each other in an interactive posture than if they're not facing each other. Interestingly, these effects largely disappear when you invert the stimuli, suggesting that like other classic visual stimuli like faces, maybe there are also inversion effects for social interactions. Their group has also shown that when you show people stimuli like these in the fMRI scanner, there are regions of visual cortex that are engaged, in particular subsets of the extrastriate body area, that seem to respond not just to single bodies, but pairs of bodies when they're facing each other. These behavioral visual effects also extend to dynamic social interactions. So for example, in stimuli like these, where point light figures are interacting, you have better detection thresholds for each agent when they're interacting with each other. And in my postdoc work with Nancy Kamwisher, we found a region in the right superior temporal sulcus, or STS, that's selectively engaged when you watch interacting videos like this, compared to matched point light stimuli where the two agents are not interacting. You can even, importantly, when you localize these regions in individual subjects, so I'm showing here in one subject their social interaction region in red, it's separate from regions that are part of the theory of mind network, like the TPJ in blue, and also separate from other visual processing regions that are nearby, like those involved in processing faces or motion. And in more recent work, led by a former postdoc in the lab, Amy Lee Masson, she found that this distinction between social interaction perception and theory of mind exists even when you watch a more complex narrative, like an episode of a television show. So even though in these cases, mentalizing and social interaction perception are very closely related, you can still find unique variants for when people watch social interactions along the STS that is separate from the theory of mind network. And in ongoing work, Hannah Small has found that if you localize these regions with the point light stimuli and then show the same subjects a movie, so the localized regions are in green, you see a strong overlap between the voxels that respond most to the point lights interacting and those that respond to interactions, even in these very different visual movies. And so together, this evidence converges with a recent proposal from David Pitcher and Leslie Ungerleider, arguing that in addition to the classic ventral and dorsal streams, we should consider a third visual pathway along the lateral surface of the brain. They suggested that this projects from early visual regions and motion-selective MT through the extrastriate body area, and then along the posterior and anterior STS, the regions I was just telling you about. They also argued that this pathway is organized hierarchically, like is typical of visual pathways. So for example, information would, like in the ventral stream, flows for the output of information in one region serves as input to the next. And as you move more and more anterior, information becomes more and more abstract and complex, going from cells that respond to simple lines and edges all the way up to whole objects. And there's some evidence that a similarly increasingly abstract hierarchy exists in the lateral stream. So for example, EVC and MT respond to early visual features, like low-level visual statistics and motion energy. And then we know that there are regions in lateral occipital cortex that respond to scene and object features as they relate to people's actions and interactions. So are the people interacting in close-up or far-away space? Are they interacting with an object, like Ramia and Sylvia with this egg? And like I mentioned, the extrastriate body area seems to represent whether the people are nearby each other, facing, et cetera. And then, which we term these sort of social primitive features. And then these regions in the STS seem to represent something as abstract as whether they're interacting or not. But these have all been sort of evaluated with separate, relatively small-scale experiments and never looked at comprehensively in the same subjects. So in separate work, again led by Emily in collaboration with Mick Bonner, we set out to test this hypothesis and asked, are the features of social scenes computed hierarchically along these regions? In order to comprehensively test this wide swath of cortex, we wanted videos that would sample different social features. At the same time, though, we wanted to maintain some level of control, so Emily selected a subset of videos from the Moments in Time computer vision data set that all consisted of 2 people in doing a wide variety of everyday actions. So in total, we had 250 videos of 2-person actions, and we played these to people just like this in the fMRI scanner without sound. We also collected a bunch of annotations for the features. So we got the output of a low-level layer of AlexNet as our measure of low-level visual features. We extracted motion energy features. And then we had human annotators label these different features based on the prior hypotheses. So they labeled scene and object features, the social primitive features like whether people are nearby or facing, social interactions, both these physical interactions like hugging or carrying, but also the communicative interactions, and then finally, affective features, valence, and arousal. So we showed subjects these videos in a condition-rich fMRI exam, study. Each subject saw the videos 10 to 20 times, and so as a result, we got really reliable data. And in particular, we had high reliability along the STS. This data was quite high quality in these regions, even compared to much larger, very impressive data sets like the natural scenes data set that only sample static scene content. And so to understand how the different features relate to the fMRI data, we used an encoding model approach. So for each video, we took the set of labeled features and learned the linear mapping between the features and each voxel's activity. And then on held-out data, we used those features to predict the fMRI response in to each held-out video and correlated predicted and true responses to get an encoding score for each voxel. And so here's the reliability again. And you can see that the encoding performance is, again, quite high along all of these lateral regions. We can also look at this as an ROI, with an ROI approach, so averaging the performance in each region of interest. And so I'm organizing the lateral stream regions here from posterior on the left to anterior on the right. And in EVC, you can see the purple bar. The encoding performance is above chance and pretty close to the noise ceiling in gray. And this is true for all of our lateral stream regions. And so this tells us how much variance is explained by our full model. But what we really wanted to understand was the feature tuning of these different regions. And so we turned to a variance partitioning approach to ask what's the unique variance explained by each of these sets of features. So for example, if I want to calculate the unique variance explained by the social primitives, what I can do is fit a model with all of the features except for that one and take the difference between the full model and the ablated model, if you will, and that will give me the unique variance explained by one subset of features. All right, so we did this first for the different groups of features in each ROI. So I'm going to start by showing you the results in our early visual regions, early visual cortex and MT. And what you see is that the early visual features best explain the responses in these regions, which is reassuring. We next turn to these 2 mid-level regions. And what we see is that while in LOC we do have good predictivity and a good amount of unique variance explained by these mid-level features, we don't see that so much in EBA, despite the prior evidence suggesting it. But I think there are lots of reasons why this might be. And importantly, these 2 regions are really close by. So I think in whole, we do see that there's good mid-level representations in these regions. And then finally, in the most anterior regions, I think kind of strikingly, the only feature we see unique variance explained by are these social interaction features. And so as we move from early to more anterior regions, we see that the representations become more and more abstract, like it's kind of a hallmark of hierarchical representations. We can also see this at the whole brain level. So if I color each voxel by the feature that has the most unique variance explained in that voxel, This is the data in one representative subject. You see a lot of grays and blues in the more posterior regions, more purples and yellows. And then along the STS, it's really a preponderance of this teal social interaction representation. In that case, though, I looked at, we grouped the different features together. We can also look at whether any of the individual features that we labeled explained unique variance. This is a very stringent test because a lot of the features are all related to each other. They're natural movies. But what we see now are there are two features that really explain unique variance across the whole brain responses. The first is whether an action is directed at an object. And we see responses in these left lateralized LOTC regions, which is kind of nicely confirmatory of prior work. The other feature we found are these communication features. And here we see pretty strong responses bilaterally along the STS. I want to remind you again that these videos have no sound. And this was kind of surprising because it also suggests that above and beyond all of these features I told you about, it's really trying to visually recognize whether people are communicating that is driving responses in these regions. And so I think this suggests that it gives us some preliminary evidence that we're delving into a bit more, that information in these regions is organized hierarchically along the lateral stream. And in particular, it suggests that recognizing communicative interactions might be a key role of these regions. So we've known for a long time that they're involved in processing information about individual bodies and faces, but this suggests that even something as high level and abstract as whether people are communicating is also a key feature here. Okay, so on the next part of my talk, I'm going to tell you about how well current models do at this task, and what computational factors in them seem to be important for predicting human responses. So we know from the last decade of research, and we've heard quite a bit about it at this conference, that deep neural networks do a good job of predicting neural responses along the ventral stream to static scenes. And so I'm highlighting work here led by Colin Conwell, but this has been shown by many groups, that now if you look at predictivity to static scene responses in the ventral stream, we don't just have a few vision models, but we have a bunch of vision models that can all match human responses almost at the level of the noise ceiling. And interestingly, what Colin has found, as well as work led by Adrian Dorig, is that this is true not only for vision model embeddings of scenes, but also for language model embeddings of sentences describing the scenes. And I think pretty surprisingly, even language models are basically almost at the noise ceiling of explaining ventral stream responses. But what about if instead of static scenes like this, I'm talking about scenes that richly sample dynamic social content like this? How well in that case do DNNs do at explaining these responses? And do we have the same wealth and diversity of models that we have to solve this task? So we set out to ask this question in work led by Kathy Garcia and Emily McMahon, also with Colin. Some of you probably heard Kathy's talk on this earlier. So we took the same fMRI responses that I just told you about. In order to also evaluate language models, we collected sentence captions from subjects online for each of the videos. So subjects gave us a one-sentence caption of each video. We passed either the video, the individual frames, or the sentences into video, image, and language models, and extracted the layer-wise responses, and asked how well those layer-wise responses matched the fMRI data. We did this for an impressive array of models. They collected really quite the model zoo of about 350 image, video, and language models, including several state-of-the-art models. And so here I'm going to plot the predictivity of these models separated by their broad group. And so again, I'm organizing the regions of interest from posterior to anterior. And so starting with image models in early visual cortex, each dot is an individual model. There's about 300 of them, and the solid bar represents the average of the model class. And the first thing we can see is that both image and video models do an okay job at predicting early visual cortex responses. And they both do a significantly better job than language models, which others have shown with static images as well, and presumably means that early visual cortex, I think kind of reassuringly, doesn't have this high-level semantic content in it. Next, we can look at these mid-level regions. And we see that image and language models are doing roughly the same, but none of them are doing great at matching the noise ceiling. In contrast, though, the video models here provide a kind of surprising boost in performance. This is even though some of our image models are really big modern models, and most of the video models, just because of availability and ease of use, are somewhat older. You can see this at the whole brain level as well, where I'm plotting the voxel-wise predictivity for the best image versus best video versus best image model. You can see that there's a pretty big gap in these regions. However, this advantage goes away in the more anterior regions of the STS, where there's really no models that do a good job of predicting. As a point of comparison, we also looked at the ventral stream. So I'm plotting one scene selective region, the PPA, that's on the ventral stream. And here I'm going to highlight a few different things. So first of all, here the image models are doing pretty well. Several of them are even at the level of the noise ceiling. Video models also do a pretty good job here. So this suggests that it's not something about the quality or size of the data set that's leading to poor predictivity in these lateral regions. It really is something different that's happening in the lateral stream that's not captured in these regions. We also see slightly worse performance of the language models in these regions compared to the vision models. And this is somewhat in contrast with the results I showed you about before with static scenes. The ventral stream was not really the focus of this work, but we can look at the whole brain responses. So here's a ventral view of the right hemisphere. You can see that the best vision model does better in most of these regions than the best language model, which I think highlights the importance of using dynamic, ecologically relevant stimuli, even for our ventral stream investigations. But I want to draw you back to the main point here, which is that compared to in these ventral stream regions, we have no models that are doing a good job at predicting these lateral stream regions. We also did the same thing with the behavior, so we can see how well the model embeddings predict behavior. And so our first feature was a kind of typical scene feature, whether it was a large or small scene. All the models do a great job. That's not really true of any of the other features we labeled or any of the other models, with the exception of language models at predicting these like physical interactions, presumably because a lot of the captions have verbs in them like people are dancing or jumping. But the main thing I want to highlight here is the relatively poor performance of these vision models in even matching these pretty simple behavioral judgments. I'm going to also return to the stimuli. So these are natural videos. They were not really designed to trick these models. In fact, they're sampled from a computer vision data set. And so they're exactly the type of stimuli that these models were trained on. Although they are dynamic, they're pretty short. They don't have tons of motion. They're not really extended events. But most of these models still can't tell you that the people on the top are close by and interacting, and the people on the bottom are far away and not. And I think this is really striking and reveals a serious deficiency in these models. But it also kind of raises a puzzling question for me, which is that if I'm arguing that social interactions are recognized visually, why do all of these vision models do such a bad job? It's not just this evidence, but there's been a lot of work showing that vision models do a bad job of matching human judgments on recognizing social interactions. This has been used as evidence that perhaps humans use something more like a generative world model to recognize these interactions rather than relying on visual stimuli. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So going back to this hill climbing example, you can see that the triangle is helping the red circle. And there are sort of two schools of thought for how you are doing this. The first suggests that you use something like a generative model of the world with explicit knowledge of agents and the physical world. So for example, in this setting, these are often modeled with generative inverse planning models that can extract information about the agent, and then from their generative world models, sample hypotheses about what the agents might be doing. So this hypothesis space would suggest that maybe the red circle wants to go up the hill, and one possible goal of the triangle is to help it, and another possible goal is to hinder it. Then these models can simulate the trajectories for what each of these would look like. And just to reiterate again, these models both suggest that humans and they themselves use something like a generative world model to do this. So in this case, it's a hierarchical planner and physics simulator that they use to sample the trajectories in this space. They then compare the observed trajectory with the true trajectory and use this to make a prediction about what type of social interaction is happening. And so to date, these are the best models of this task in terms of matching human performance. But one problem is that they are computationally expensive, and most forms right now are not tractable on natural images. But I think more importantly, they go counter to the evidence I've been telling you about, that there's a lot of this type of information that humans can recognize just based on bottom-up vision. And so in contrast, a bottom-up vision model would look something like the DNNs I've been telling you about. You would take the same information about the agents, but just pass it through a series of hierarchical computations to directly predict the social relationship. But like I just showed you, these models are bad. So what's going on? What are humans using? And what do we need to make our computational models match this? So we revisited the question of whether visual computations are sufficient for recognizing social interactions. And to do this, a PhD student of the lab, Manasi Malik, built a new visual model that had a relational inductive bias in it. And this is implemented in the form of a graph structure. OK, so what do I mean? So these are the two agents you just saw, that yellow triangle and red circle. You can vectorize visual information about them, like their size, position, velocity, and pass it through a neural network to predict, helping or hindering. This doesn't work very well. What you can do instead is make these two agents nodes in a graph and represent not only information about them, but also the edges between them based on their input structure, their visuospatial cues. And in that way, you can pass this simple graph or a more complex graph that has more entities in the visual scene through the same type of bottom-up neural network to make a prediction. And this is a form of a graph neural network, or GNN, that we combined with a recurrent neural network that I'll tell you about in a minute to make predictions about social interactions. And so we called this model social GNN. One thing I want to say is that this model is based on kind of a growing wealth of research in using GNNs to model these sorts of things. But it has some key differences that I'm happy to talk about if people have questions. All right, so to evaluate this model, we used this great data set from Josh Tenenbaum's lab made by Aviv Netanyahu and Tianmin Xu called the phase data set. So they parametrically generated a ton of these types of animated shape stimuli like I just showed you. So they made a bunch of videos that have two agents with physical and social goals, two objects, walls, and landmarks. And so the agents can be helping each other achieve their goal, like these two were having a friendly interaction and both trying to get the ball to the green landmark. They can also have adversarial interactions where one agent blocks the other, or kind of neutral interactions where they're each have their own separate physical goals. And because of the simulator they designed to make these, they could generate parametrically infinitely many of these. And so I think they had 500 in total. And so in order to evaluate our neural network on these models, we first had to extract graphs from each of these video frames. So the first thing we did was represent each agent and object as a node in our graph and input features for those nodes. So those included the position, velocity, the heading direction or angle, and the size of the agents at each time step. And then we formed them into graphs by putting input edges between agents just based on whether they were in contact or not. So there are more complex ways you could do this that I'm happy to talk about as well. But just as a simple first step, if two entities are touching, there's a bidirectional edge between them. So in this case, the red agent and green agent are both touching the blue ball. And importantly, while these are dataset features that were released with the dataset, a pretty trivial vision algorithm could extract all of this information. And we feed these graphs frame by frame into the GNN. Okay. And so at each time step, the input frame is fed to the GNN, which does some recurrent processing that's very similar to an LSTM. And then at each subsequent frame, the new input graph is put in and combined with information in the prior time step, until the final time step when a linear classifier is trained to make a classification about whether it's a friendly, neutral, or adversarial interaction. So we compared our model to a very similar visual RNN that takes the same input information, but instead of structuring these as a graph, just puts in kind of an ordered list of all the features of these agents without the graph structure processing into a standard vanilla LSTM at each time that has the same size and roughly the same number of tunable parameters, and at the last time step is trained in the same way to make this friendly, neutral adversarial classification. We also compared these to a generative inverse planning model created by the authors with the release of this data set. All right. So we evaluated all of these models and their ability to match human social interaction judgments. Humans agree most of the time on these videos, but not perfectly, like about 85% of the time. So the visual recurrent neural network does above chance. So as a reminder, chance is 1/3. But does significantly worse than the inverse planning model, which is at the level of human agreement. This is what they showed in the original paper. But now with just one small tweak, our model does almost as well as the inverse planning model. It still slightly falls behind on this particular task of generalization, but it does so with only a small fraction of both the runtime and memory requirements of the inverse planning model. Also, if instead of just looking at the absolute accuracy of these models, you use something like RSA to compare the representational match and consider the full pattern of different judgments that humans make, these models now perform identically. And interestingly, if you do like a partial correlation to look at the unique variance in judgments explained by each of them, what you see is that they both actually explain a lot of unique variance, suggesting that they're capturing different aspects of human strategies in judging these videos. Another thing this suggests is that the neural network is not just learning some instantiation of the inverse planning model, but maybe doing something different to capture different aspects of how humans do this task. One major advantage of these neural networks is that they can operate on natural videos. So in the same way we can make graphs from these animated shape videos, I can put bounding boxes around the people and objects in a natural video, extract deep neural network embeddings for those pixel spaces, and similarly form the nodes into a graph by making edges based on where the people are looking at. In this case, we compared to a match just to a standard convolutional neural network baseline because we couldn't operate the inverse planning model on these videos, which is at chance. In this case, the visual RNN does a little better, presumably because it takes into account the dynamic information better than the standard CNN. And the social GNN does even better. Another major advantage of having a neural model of these abilities is that you can pretty straightforwardly compare them to human neuroimaging data. So in ongoing work, Manasi is showing these videos to subjects in the fMRI scanner, and she can use RSA to compare the fMRI responses, this is a searchlight RSA, to the behavior in different brain regions. And she sees a good match to behavior in these lateral stream regions I mentioned, and also good predictivity of social GNN in these same regions. And so this suggests that a visual model can recognize social interactions. And it doesn't need an explicit information or an explicit model of either agent's goals or the physical world. It can learn to do this just from visuospatial computations. But importantly, relational representations are a key to do this, right? So without that, you really are doing not a very good job at this task. And I think this is something that, in theory, neural networks could learn, but I think with the types of tasks and structure they have is just not something they're getting right now. And so I think this is one way we as cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists can still think about structures that we should be building into these models to allow them to do these more challenging tasks. All right, so I've told you that the ability to visually recognize other people's social interactions is a core human ability. And something we should be thinking more about people as people who build computational vision models. It's computed hierarchically along the lateral visual stream, but it relies on both dynamics and relational computations to do this. But taking a step back, I think that this reliance on dynamics and relations is important not only for social perception, but for replicating visual intelligence more generally, right? In order to understand what's happening in the scene, you need to have some representation of the entities and how they relate to each other over time. And so I think for anybody studying visual intelligence, we should be thinking about this and thinking about tasks that can better tap into these abilities. And I also think that as modelers, we should be thinking about ways to bring in insights from more structured cognitive models into our image computable deep neural networks. And I think that's how we're going to make progress on this kind of vast space of open problems that I still see between scene and object recognition and all of the other cognitive abilities that humans have that are interface with vision. So with that, I just want to thank my lab, and I'm really happy to take any questions. Yeah, in the back.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. There was an idea that you mentioned about building like world models where you can learn the inverse mapping of the structure and use that in a real case. There is some linked work by David Ha et al. In 2018, Nurup's work on using these as like structured environments, and you can basically learn like a policy environment directly from like a gym environment and make that for an agent to explore. Is that like the kind of like work that people can take ideas from literature?
Yeah, that's a great point. That sounds very interesting. So just to make sure I heard you, the idea is you can you're talking about other ways to make hybridized models between structured. Did you say reinforcement? Sorry, it's a little hard to hear you.
Yeah, so it's a David Ha's paper, World Models.
Okay.
So it basically uses the reinforcement learning environments and learns to train the policy in that environment, and then uses the agent only in the real phase to test that policy out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those are some ideas which I thought
yeah, that does sound very interesting and related. I'll have to check it out. So when you say the real case, you mean on natural videos?
Yeah, so basically, it feels, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think there's a lot of very interesting work going on in this space between trying to hybridize, cognitive and reinforcement learning models and deep neural networks. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. The main way we're still thinking about it is what are the kind of simple inductive biases you can put into these deep learning models. But I think there's a lot of clever ways of thinking about how a cognitive model can interact with a deep learning model, and the two can, to train on these sorts of tasks. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, go here, then here.
Thank you for your talk. So, out of my curiosity, so when you said the graph neural network, we are as a human we are good at segmenting the picture. For example, when we see a fisherman, yes, and we can segment it as a one entity, and the background like trees or sea or whatever. So, in what you can similarly in the sentence, we can use transformers. So we tokenize a sentence and then see the relation between words, and then in translation we consider all of those details. So similarly, we can do the segmentation of the image if it is a sequence, and then do similarly for the transformer for the sentence. We can do it for the segmented of the pictures, right, and then frames. So in what level, first of all, in what level you do graph neural network? Mm-hmm. And second, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so the idea is you could, just like you can segment and tokenize a sentence and put it into a sentence transformer, you can do the same thing in space. You can visually segment the video and put it into a vision transformer. Yeah, I mean, so we did that. A lot of the, yes, you can do that. I think that one thing that's still missing, though, is that the regions of pixel space don't correspond to entities in a meaningful way across videos in the same way that words do across sentences. And so I think having this first entity detection step is important to that. Now, after that, you could put those entities into a transformer, and that might work even better than the GNN. But in the kind of DNN benchmarking results I showed you, we had a lot of vision transformers in there, and those don't, at least in the off-the-shelf ones, don't capture this information. So I think it's for several reasons, but I think both because of the fact that regions of pixel space don't align to entities in a straightforward way, and also probably to some effect because of the tasks they're trained on. They don't get this, even though that you're right that they have lots of elements that should allow them to get it.
You can take leverage of the, when you have a movie, you have the frames and you have the sequences, and then you can see that, let's say trees and sea, and those are not changing, not moving. So, but the two bodies are changing. So it's easier for you guys to, for example, find that this segment and this segment. It's probably interactive.
I see. So you could do the segmentation based on the motion. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, that was a really excellent talk. Thank you. You said right at the kind of second to last slide something about explicit representations of the tasks that GNNs don't have. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. How you know they don't have an explicit representation? Now, maybe you mean a symbolic representation, but you sure are using networks with latent spaces and attention-like mechanisms, and I'm wondering whether or not those are implementing an inverse planning model the same way you could do it in Python or Julia or something.
Yeah, great question. I think this is happening for a few reasons. First, but you're right that I guess I still would have said implicitly they could be learning something. Okay. But I take your point. So maybe they're learning something like the inverse planning models. I don't think that's true, because if it was, I think they would explain totally overlapping variance in the human behavior, and they don't seem to. We're also trying to get at this in a few other ways. So we have, each of the agents has a physical goal. Does the GNN have lower, I guess in this case, channeling Talia Kunkel's talk, a lowercase representation of the physical goal? We're looking at that now. It seems like not much. So those are the reasons why I think that it could have learned something just like the inverse planning model that also extracts these goals, but it seems to be relying on other cues to do that. But it's a great question, and something we're still looking into, also with the neural data as well, comparing both models. Yes, and a hard problem.
Thank you for the great talk. It was really insightful. I was wondering, do you think the social visual recognition thingy are specialized for the lateral visual cortexes, or meaning that if I try to perturb the other cortexes, do you think it will be still confined to the lateral visual cortex? And related to that, do you think still the network trained, if we are not label the social labels and fit them to the network, do you still think that it will going to appear in the social GNN that you mentioned in the later part of the talk?
Okay, so let me answer. So your first question is, do I think that the information is constrained to these regions, or is it also in, say, ventral regions or something like that? And then is there a causal involvement? So we looked at ventral regions, and ventral regions don't seem to represent things. I mean, in the same way, they don't seem to have the feature tuning for these properties I'm telling you about. But that said, I think it's still an open question, and there, as far as I know, isn't a ton of great causal evidence on this yet. But that's the conjecture. Can you repeat the second part? If I train the models on social tasks?
Without labeling the social labels and fed them to the network when you're training the network, I mean.
Oh, I see. If the GNN was trained without the social labels?
Yes, precisely. It's like a perturbing the brain without other inputs to the ventral network.
And you would train it on a different task or an unsupervised? That's an interesting question. And the idea would be to train it in an unsupervised way or on a different. I mean, there's some other ways that you could train the GNN, like on next frame trajectory prediction or something like that. Those we didn't directly compare, but other work has done that, and those don't seem to work as well. But that said, there are still other unsupervised things that it would be very interesting to try. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go, Hope.
Hi, thanks for sharing your really cool work. I am wondering if you can say a little bit more about how you started carving out the different social interaction and social vision primitives and what led you to test the ones that you did. It seems like there's like a really wide space of things. So I'm just wondering how you constrain them.
Great question. We really turned to the prior behavioral and neuroimaging results. In particular, like there are some really strong vision effects for some of these things, like like adaptation effects or like unconscious recognition effects and things like that. And so we tried to focus on, and we reviewed in the paper those ones that had that, those behavioral signatures. But yes, I agree, it's still like a very open area, and I think there's lots of other things to test. So yeah, good question.
Very cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hey, really, really interesting talk. Yeah, I'm curious about what directions you're going. Do you think that this could be well modeled by like amortized social reward inference? Like that's like the goal that people are optimizing over, or are there other things you think are good directions? Yeah, very curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't, and this relates to the last question. I guess we haven't thought a ton about the learning signals yet. Right now, we've kind of done this supervised training on human behavior, which is not a very biologically plausible option. But yes, I think, actually someone who has really nice work on this is Dion Benton, who has shown that like associative learning mechanisms can help get you to these similar types of help hinder judgments by like, if infants wanted to associate with agents that were helpful, and then you get a lot of these kind of help versus hinder judgments that can fall out of something like that. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the really incredible talk. A lot of the recent progress in 3D pose estimation has come from models that are trained with strong priors about 3D human bodies. I'm curious if those made it into the deep neural network benchmarking of the lateral stream, and if so, how much that explains.
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head, but we should check that. That's a really good question. It's my understanding that those models still sort of struggle with occlusion and self-occlusion when there's multiple agents, but it's a very good question.
Thanks.
Great talk, Leyla. I want to ask about the relative strength of the static and dynamic signals in the incoming input and the notion of having hierarchies in the brain. And the struggle that I deal with in my own research is that static signals are so strong in the incoming signal that kind of take over during training of a network over the dynamic signals. It might not be the case if social information becomes an important part of the, I don't know, what you are optimizing the network for, but it might also be the case that evolutionarily movement was in camouflage, for example, really important, and we developed this pathway through the evolution, and it might be worthwhile that when we develop a network, actually built in hierarchy, two separate pathways for these things to actually not, for static to take over, and then dynamic information becomes more useful in the decision of the, I don't know, what do you think about that?
Okay, great question. I think you're right that a lot of even the video models are essentially just like processing. They're like heavily dominated by the image level information rather than the dynamics. This was the motivation behind like dual stream models, some of which we have in our set, but so far those haven't really been great as computer vision models, but I think it's actually more a product of it just not being a major computer vision focus, and therefore like the data sets are worse. And so I share your intuition that those are important signals in the human brain, and I think they've only not been very successful in computer vision because they haven't really been looked at very seriously.
Okay, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. And yeah, this is the end of this session, so we have a coffee break now, and then we will reconvene at 4 p.m. for the last section of talks. Let's thank Leyla again.